class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. And right now we have Matt Nieto, a Sharks forward. And before we get into his performance on this season, we will talk a bit about the history of Matt Nieto with the San Jose Sharks. And you may be wondering, if you are a newer San Jose Sharks fan, what extensive history could he possibly have? He was only a San Jose Sharks for these past couple of years. Prior to that, he was with the Colorado Avalanche. But if you actually go further back in Nieto's career, near the beginning, he was actually originally drafted by San Jose in the 2011 entry draft in the second round and played a few years with them before actually getting waived, where he would then get picked up by Colorado. And after spending a few years there, I guess he developed his game, certainly got older, which is what a lot of coaches like to see, maybe more defensively responsible or just generally responsible off the ice. And so the Sharks brought him back, and he has been with San Jose these past couple of seasons, and he will continue to be with them at least going into the next year currently. Now, when it comes to his actual performance this season, this is going to be the first player that I'm going to be talking about from the infamous NBC line, the Nieto, Bonino, Cogliano line, a term that I have just coined pretty much right now. And the reason why this line is so infamous is for a couple of reasons. The first one is, of course, that this line was together a lot for whatever reason. Maybe Bob Booner really enjoyed the fact that their last names all ended in O, and it was kind of fun to say Nieto, Cogliano, Bonino. That could be one reason. Maybe he also really liked that term, the NBC line, and so he said, this is pretty clever, and continued to play those players together. But otherwise, it's very difficult to imagine why, because there really wasn't much from seeing them, from the eye test that said that this line was good together. And yet, when we take just from Matt Nieto's perspective, he spent over 28% of his even strength ice time with Bonino and Cogliano as his line mates. And you might be thinking, well, 28% is high, but not exceedingly high. It's not incredibly high, but it should be noted that Cogliano was traded at the trade deadline of this past season, meaning he could not play with Cogliano and Bonino as line mates over the last quarter of the year, which means through the first 3 quarters of the year, the first 61 games or so, or however many passed prior to the trade deadline, this line was together a lot. So this percentage definitely could have been up at 35, maybe even 40% had Cogliano remained with San Jose. So yes, this line played together a ton. And when we actually take a look at the stats behind this line, it was generally awful. From the outside looking in, you might be wondering how that's actually possible, because of course Nieto, Cogliano, Bonino, they all have reputation for being relatively defensively responsible players. And so while you're not expecting a lot of goals to happen for your own team when they're on the ice, you're also not really expecting a lot of goals against either. And yet that was absolutely not the case for this line. At a point this season, they were the league worst, not just the team worst, the league worst in terms of expected goals against. And by the end of this season, in terms of expected goals against per 60, if we take a look at lines that played at least 240 minutes together at even strength, this line was 11th in terms of expected goals against per 60 minutes, which, to explain that stat briefly, is basically based on the chances the opposing team actually got while this team was on the ice. How many goals would they be expected to score with average goaltending per 60 minutes that the line was on the ice? And 11th, you might be saying, that's clearly bad, but at least there are 10 lines worse than them. Well, not necessarily, because this is just expected goals against per 60, and it does not take into account expected goals for per 60. So to give an example, 5th place on this list for this stat is actually the Dahlin, Couture, and Meyer line. The thing is that while they were 5th place in terms of expected goals against per 60 minutes, they were 4th place in expected goals for per 60 minutes, which means that every 60 minutes that would pass, while this line would give up a lot of chances, they'd also manage to get a lot of chances. So they were still a net positive for the San Jose Sharks. Every 60 minutes, they'd average about 4 more expected goals than they would give up. On the other hand, since the Bonino, Cogliano, Nieto line is so inept offensively, they would give up about 5 more expected goals in those 60 minutes that passed, which was an extremely awful differential and much worse than any of the top 10 expected goals against per 60 lines on this list. So generally, this line was exceedingly bad. There was no offensive capability. Their defensive capability, for whatever reason, was also terrible, even though none of these players are necessarily in a vacuum awful defensively. They just didn't seem to work well together at all. And yet, like I mentioned earlier, Bob Booner continued to play them together over and over and over again. On to the statistics specifically for Matt Nieto. I mean, generally this wasn't a completely terrible year for Nieto in a vacuum. That's mostly because of the fact that his expectations coming into the season are not particularly high, right? I was expecting Matt Nieto to be nothing more than like a fourth liner who would be occasionally healthy scratched, and he kind of lived up to that, I would say. 70 games played, 6 goals, 11 assists for 17 points. In fact, his point totals actually are pretty decent for the role that I expected him to play, but that can also be explained with the fact that, again, for whatever reason, he did at times get minutes higher up in the lineup, right? He would occasionally actually find himself on a line with players like Logan Couture for whatever reason. And similar to Rudolf Balcers a couple of videos ago where I mentioned that it's not really the player's fault when they're put into a position where they can't possibly succeed in. That's kind of the case here for Matt Nieto. So while his point total did get slightly inflated by playing with those players, getting near the 6 goals, 11 assists for 17 points, you can't necessarily say, well, he played so much with Couture, why didn't he get even more points than that, right? Generally, 17 points, not too terrible. If we take a look at his plus-minus, though, that is something that is quite terrible, a -20. But like I mentioned earlier, once again, this is because that Cogliano, Nieto, and Bonino line was just so terrible that it really ends up deflating his plus-minus. If we actually take a look at how many more goals were scored by the opposing team when that line was on the ice compared to goals 4, we see that there was actually just a -10. Literally half of his -20 can be attributed just to the NBC line. When it comes to the other lines, the other many lines that Nieto found himself occasionally on, yes, he still built up a -10, which is not good, but it's at the very least more manageable and more, easier to swallow compared to that -10 of just that one particular line. There were even a couple of lines where Nieto was actually a plus player for. So it generally was just the fact that these three players together was like, the term greater than the sum of their parts. This was lesser than the sum of their parts pretty much. In terms of time on ice, 14 minutes and 24 seconds, which is pretty reasonable, I would say. Obviously, for a fourth liner, you usually expect a bit lower than that, but Nieto did, as I mentioned, get a lot of time on the third line with that NBC line, which somewhat inflated his ice time. He also had a few games on the second line for whatever reason, plus he gets a decent amount of short-handed ice time per game, so that all adds up to be about 14 and a half minutes. And so when it comes to his grade, like I mentioned, this wasn't a completely disappointing season for Matt Nieto, but it definitely also wasn't one where he exceeded my already very low expectations for him, which means I end up giving him a grade of a C. Class dismissed.